Welcome back everyone, and as requested last time in my video where I share 5 tips on how to play flush draws, today I'm going to be sharing some tips on how to defend your big blind. So let's jump right into it. And of course, if you do enjoy this format, and I intend to do it more often, I will be sharing 4, 5, 6 tips on specific spots. Then smash that like button, drop a comment, what would you like to see in the future, and I'm going to try to take that into consideration. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. So we have the common situation that we face an open raise from a certain position and we want to defend the big blind. But before I'm going to start sharing my tips on how to defend your big blind, we need to consider a very important concept, which is the equity realization. And in this video, I will also, of course, elaborate a little bit on what equity realization actually means. So you need to understand that you have odds and outs and you have a certain equity. You have a $100 pot and you might have 30% equity. However, this does mean that you're going to win $30 on average. Actually, as out of position player, usually you're gonna win less than that. And this is determined by the equity realization. So equity realization basically describes the share of the pot that we're going to win on the showdown, or even earlier if we take it down by raising or betting and our opponent folds. Let's take an example here with King Jack off. Let's say we have 50 big blinds. The pot is $100 and we have 30% equity pre-flop. It doesn't really matter. Let's just work, or let's take 40%. Maybe it's a bit more realistic against the cutoff range, right? So we have 40%. So how much money are we going to win in the long run? Well, you might think, well, $40, right? But this is not true. And I'm going to show you some data in order to make my point clear. Let's talk about the equity realization a little bit more in detail. This is now an example, hijack versus big blind. I think this is without antes, but it's not gonna make such a big difference here. It's just about illustrating my point so you understand how equity realization actually determines our defending range. So as you can see here, hijack opens aces to threes, king nine suited and better, jack 10 off, a very standard hijack opening range. And we're around 50 big blinds deep, right? You see it here, 50. And against that range, we have an equity realization of 73%. So that means, let's assume we have 40% with king jack off against that range. It's now just a random guess. We would make, in terms of raw equity, $70. However, you might assume that, let's say there's an ace high board, we have to fold. We're going to get bluffed out of the pot quite often. So we actually fold more often, and we always fold a lot of equity. So sometimes we're even ahead, we're 60%, yet we're not going to realize those 60% because we have to fold. Even though we are behind and we have 10, 15%, still we own a share of $15 to $10 of this pot. However, we still cannot continue because the investment of our opponent that he makes, the bet, is simply too expensive. Right? However, since we cannot just check back and see a free card as our opponent does, we always have this, we're always going to be in that predicament of facing a bet, and that always leads to us having a lower equity realization. And that in that specific opponent situation means that our opponent in position has an equity realization more than 100. So he's going to realize 130% of these $100, right? Or let's say he has 70% equity. He actually is going to realize 80% equity. So he wins $80 instead of $70. So of course his equity realization is going to be higher than 100. So in that example, let's say we have 40% equity, but our equity realization is only 72%. Let's round it up to 73 times 40, right? 40% equity in a $100 pot. So our EV in terms of raw equity would be $40, but our EV, considering the equity realization, is only 29. So in the long run, we only win $30. However, we get odds, right? So pre-flop, let's say he min raises, we get around 4-1, so we need 20% equity. So every hand that, considering its equity and its equity realization, that is higher than the $20, we want to defend. Let's take for example, you see that, for example, the offsuited aces here against the button, they have around 62, 64, 66. It always depends on the open raising range, on the stack size, of course. And yeah, you see the offsuited aces have a very, very bad equitization, right? I'll come to that later in my video as well. But this is just the concept behind, and the equitization. It changes from spot to or from position to position, and so we always consider odds, the odds we get. But if we reach certain odds, considering the equity and the equitization, then we're going to make defend. If we're going to stay below it, so let's say our equity is so bad and our equitization is also so bad, like even if you have 30% equity or 35, but you only realize 50 or 60% of that, you're gonna be below the 20%, so you have a minus EV defend. This is how we also created the ranges in the Terminal Masterclass, looking into the equity realizations and creating defending ranges from the blinds. So you always know, at least in theory, you're going to have profitable defense. That does not consider the skill level of a player. And yeah, I think you don't need to study all these numbers, but you need to understand certain thresholds. So let's say, okay, with a weak offsuited ace, you're very likely going to have somewhere between 50 and 60, maybe against loose ranges from cut off and button, when ace is more valuable, it's going to be more towards 70. So this is the baseline we need to have for this video, so you guys understand the tips that I'm about to share. Tip number 1, defend more when you're shorter. Let's look into an example that will illustrate my point much better. So here, 100 big blind versus under the gun, assuming we face in 2.5x open raise. You see, we don't defend that wide. Why? Because a hand like King 9 off has a very, very bad equity realization. Right, I can tell you it's probably only around 60%. So if we do a little work here with Equilab and we give our opponent under the gun range, you see we only have 34% equity. Again, that's the raw equity. If it's a $100 pot, we would win, according to the raw equity, $34. However, we need to consider equity realization, and if we only realize 60% of it, then it should be pretty clear, let's even take 35, that it becomes very marginal. And against a 2.5x open raise, you need more than 21% equity, right? So you can see that also in case if you work with a replayer, it always displays you the odds. So here against a 2.2x open raise, you see we actually need around 25%. Here it's a 5-handed game, so there are less antes. It would be a little bit less in a full ring game, but you see those, what was it? Yeah, those 21% equity that we have, we probably need around 23%, so it would be minus EV defend. Or you at least see how close it is, and we can easily skip that. King 10 off is then the first time we want to defend, and we even want to forward a lot of these offsuited aces. You also don't need to sit down and break down the exact numbers when you see, okay, this is a very, very marginal defend, and you don't play against a clearly weaker opponent, then just forward. There's no point chasing a break-even spot. Now let's compare that with 20 big blinds, with big blind versus UTG. Okay. It's, of course, I think it's based on 2.2x open raise now. We defend much wider, right? And this is not just because the smaller open raise, but mainly because of the equity realization. And why? Imagine you hit something, you can very often just check jam, and it becomes even crazier when you have 15 big blinds or 10 big blinds. When you hit a draw, you can check jam. You can get your opponent more often off his equity. You cannot just check jam with 100 big blinds. You can barely get the money in on the flop. You need to have a very strong hand. If the board is 9-5-4 and you hit something with your 10-9, you can just check jam to protect your equity, right? But with 100 big blinds, you don't really want to raise. You don't really want to get the money in on the flop, right? Or even if the board is 10-5-4 and you have 6-5, you can just check jam, protect your hand against all his queen jacks, ace kings, ace jacks, all his overcards, and even if you do get caught, you still have 5 outs to win. So that's why we play way more aggressive. We play way more check shoving with 20 big blinds, which ultimately leads in an increase in a higher equity realization. Also, what most players do subconsciously, and it's the right thing, they start checking back more flops. That's good, and that's, as I said, it is according to theory, because otherwise you're gonna get check jam too often off your equity, especially on drawy boards, right, where the big blind can just check jam a lot of his draws. And what does it mean? It means that now, since you're shorter as the big blind, you're going to see more often turns, which will help to increase your equity realization, because you see turns more often for cheap, or for free actually. So also the c-betting frequency significantly decreases the shorter we get, and this increases our equity realization. We can also look at into an example here. If we, for example, have the button 15% spot, and 15 big blind spot, sorry, you see a hand like ace-3 off has 67% equity realization. And with 30 big blind against a similar, it's a cutoff, it's a little bit tighter, but 8% difference. This is a lot. This is in a $100 pot, $8. This is, of course, first of all, caused by that the cutoff has a little tighter range. And against tighter ranges, our equity realization is always a little worse. However, the main difference is that we're so much shallower with 15 big blinds than with 30 big blinds. And we're going to realize our equity is so much better. All right. There are, of course, always some outliers, but most of the time we're going to have a higher equity realization. Tip number 2, when 3-betting, make sure that with deeper stack size, around 100 big blinds, you 3-bet strong suited connectors that are not necessarily just 6-5 or 5-4 suited, but more like Jack-10 suited, 10-9 suited, strong suited kings, strong suited aces, especially against tight ranges. So if we go into the 100 big blind range, you see that our bluffs from the big blind are actually quite strong. For most players, they're very natural to defend with, and you don't need to do that against recreationals because you don't need to be balanced. But if you play against good opponents, regulars, and they see you only have a 1% 3-betting range from the big blind, it's hard to get value from your aces and kings. But if they know that you can also bluff from the big blind, you're getting paid more often. And it's not that we put ourselves in a minus EV spot to get more money from our overpairs. They're still very profitable to 3-bet a hand like Queen 10, Queen Jack suited. You get value from, you make them fold a hand like King Jack off, King 10 off, make them even sometimes fold King Queen offs. I mean, if you open raise from another gun, the big blind 3-bets, do you really want to call King Queen off? So you start folding out better hands, and you still have incredible playability post-flop, and you will also hit some hands on boards where you perceived are not going to have so many value hands, right? But if we look into 30 big blinds, you see that now we start 3-betting more high card hands. And there are two different approaches. Some of you might say, well, Ben, I've seen some Monka ranges and it advises me to 3-bet high card hands, offsuited high card hands, especially against later position. A lot of trashy hands where it's button like Queen 7 off, King 4 off. And that's totally okay. However, we do need to consider that we are human beings, and all these solves are basically based on what machines are delivering, and we are not machines. And these offsuited high card hands, you're still going to get called, are very hard to play post-flop if you don't hit a pair, and you're not going to hit any draws, right? Yes, in terms of the EV, they probably make a little bit more profit pre-flop because you have good blocker effects. You block aces, ace king, ace queen hands they're going to go all in with that stack size. So you reduce the likelihood. But then if called, it's going to be very difficult and it's more likely that you're going to make mistakes. So I think in the long run, you might lose more EV if, or in comparison to 3-betting hands like 7-6 suited, 6-5 suited, 9-7 suited. So I think both approaches are fine. You can also make adjustments based on your opponent. If I play against someone who's rather passive and not so aggressive, I'm more inclined to 3-bet suited connectors because, yeah, they're not going to be a 4-bet shoving so much on me, and I will realize my equity. I want to see a flop and a turn, and they're not going to be bluffing that much on the flop. And vice versa, I'm more inclined to 3-bet an ace-9 off, so I block also their aggressive GTO 4-bet all-ins with ace-5 suited, ace-4 suited, of course the ace-kings, ace-queens, and aces. And then I also more inclined to hit a strong pair with 9-7, 7-6 suited. You're never going to really hit strong pairs. You really come more from making draws, of course, and then you can check shove or bet the flop, jam the turn with the equity you have, make them fold better hands. So again, you need to be aware of both approaches. I'm not saying either right or wrong. You definitely need to consider more than just what a Monker solver is delivering you or any kind of GTO solve and is showing you EV. That's not your EV. That's the EV of the solve that plays perfect. But if you fuck it up post-flop, your EV is going to be way worse. So yes, you might want to sacrifice a little bit EV of pre-flop in terms of blocker effects, but you will gain more EV by simplifying your life, by having easier decisions post-flop and simplifying things. But bottom line, with deeper stack sizes, try to aim 3-betting very strong suited broad raise, suited aces, because you're going to be very deep. You don't want to 3-bet too much garbage. Tip number 3, defend wide with offsuited high card hands, late position, and very tight from against early position. I mean, if we look in a very common stack size here, button versus cutoff, you see, this is not button versus cutoff, big blind versus cutoff. You see we defend a lot of offsuited kings, offsuited queens. They're way more valuable against button cutoff, hijack. So if we take an under the gun position, you see that against the what is the sizing 2.3x, we defend king 8 off, queen 9 off, and only against the min raise, but do not consider the light green yet. You see that we're even folding some weaker offsuited aces, and here against the 2.3x we defend queen 5 off, king 3 off, way more, even jack 7 off, and once again here we're not even defending jack 8 off. So way tighter against the early positions. When you're really not sure, all these hands, you have seen the equity realization with these offsuited aces against even cutoff button. It's only around 60 to 70%. Against under the gun, it goes more towards 50 to 60%. You're only going to realize half of the equity that you actually have because you have to check forward that often. And also, you're going to lose way more, a lot of money when you hit your ace because you're going to be dominated. You need to take into consideration when you hit your ace, you never can really play big pots with ace 5 off unless you hit a 2-pair. But when your opponent is doing a lot of betting or you're doing a lot of betting, you get called and the pot gets bigger, chances are high your opponent has a better ace. And this is a problem. This also means that your equalization drops because you lose more money when you hit a hand. And ultimately, your opponent wins more hands with the stronger hands. So this is also pretty bad for our equalization. So that's why we want to be so tight here with the high cards. Tip number 4, and this is more an exploitative tip, when you play with stats and you see someone who has a very low c-bet. I would say around 80% in position is a decent c-betting strategy. If you see someone who has in position c-bet only 60 or 70%, you need to make adjustments. You can defend any offsuited ace, of course, because you're going to see turns more often. And then all these marginal defense become much better because 10% of the time you're going to see a turn for free. And it's not going to be winning a jackpot, but it will add over the time because you're going to see turns more for free more often. And if you don't play with a database or with stats or heart, so let's say party poker and other sites where you can't play with the heart, you need to pay attention, then play less tables, right? Or if you play live, if there's someone who checks back on boards where he's supposed to see bet range, like an ace king high board or king queen, and you see him checking back quite often, you know, okay, against this opponent you need to defend better. You don't need to have a HUD. You don't even need to have a big sample size, even though if you don't play a lot. If you see there's a guy and only he played 3 hands and he has been checking back only once on a very favorable board, it's not a huge read, but it's already a tendency. Of course, he could have been trapping, but use that information to at least pay more attention to that respective spot that he might be under c-betting, and this is good. And then, of course, it also goes in the opposite side where you have overly aggressive opponents that c-bet every single time and they keep barreling a lot of turns and they're just maniacs, right? Then you even want to skip more of these margin spots. Wait until you hit a hand, so they're gonna hang themselves.
First time.
Give them as much rope as possible. And yes, you could also play back and check raise more, but the problem is aggressive opponents are also capable then of 3-bet bluffing you on the flop. So you need to be willing to punt your stack off and then 4-bet jam and just really go hardcore after them, or you back the fuck off and you're just tight and you just play patient and you wait for good hands. These two adjustments, this in-between kind of wannabe aggressiveness, a check raise here or 3-bet there, that's not going to work out against really aggressive opponents because they can sense that. You're not the first one that tries to make counter adjustments against them. So they expect already some more 3-bets, some more check raises. And since they know they play a lot of hands, it's easily possible that they are going to play back. Believe me, I've played millions of hands. I've played against small pools where we had a lot of history dynamics and where I tried to exploit aggressive opponents. And it's a rarity that an aggressive opponent that likes to be aggressive is going to give up once he faces the 3-bets. Usually it's not the case, and you need to take that into consideration. And last but not least, also an exploitative tip. Of course, if you play against recreationals, you want to be involved in pots with them. You have a baseline of what you want to defend, add 1 or 2 more hands against recreations. At some point, if you play like real garbage, it's really going to be hard to make that make up the EV that you're losing when you defend those weak hands, just because your opponent is much worse than you. So yes, you want to defend looser, but don't overdo it. This is just it's of course a very generic tip because it depends on the opponent, it depends on the stack size and the position, but something to keep in mind. If you have your range that you want to play from the big blind against MP for 50 big blinds and you see there's clearly a weaker opponent entering the pot, he's opening, and you know the 10-8 off here, as we have it on the screen, would be the first hand you want to defend. You know, okay, I'm going to be defending 10-7 off, 10-6 off, perhaps 9-7 off. Add 1 or 2 hands in that respective area of hands, and then you're good to go. Of course, if it's a huge, super mega wear, then even 9-5 off and 8-4 off. Again, this is where it comes a bit more with your experience and your intuition. But always be honest with yourself. Don't just enter the pot 9 to, oh, he's weaker. Again, you need to know what you want to exploit. Is he a calling station? Are you going to go hardcore for value? Don't want to bluff him. These are precise reads and precise orders, instructions to yourself what you want to do against this opponent. Otherwise, it's just your ego trying to make you look better than you actually are. Saying, oh, he's weak, I'm going to play more hands. If you can't define what exactly makes him a weak player, probably you're the sucker and you're just having a big ego. So keep that in mind. I hope these 5 tips have helped you. Of course, there's so much more to playing from the big blind, but this I could make a 5-hour webinar. So a few quick tips. They still need some studying. Again, there's no magic pill, guys. Please don't take it the wrong way, but I want to give you a little push in the right direction, and then I hope it will help you. You're going to crush from the big blind, and then see you at the tables, and see you next time.